Are here for the Lindenville sub-area meeting, part of a series of meetings of the general plan update process that Eric will speak to a bit more here shortly. Before we get started, I just want to cover a couple logistical items. If Eric can go to the next slide. We do have a live Spanish interpreter available for this meeting, as we have for all meetings. Jasmine is available, and obviously the language here is in Spanish for those that have dialed in and want to get access to the Spanish live interpretation functions. This is how they would do that. You all probably saw that option as you dialed in, so we just want to make sure that that was clear. Then the next slide, just wanted to give a quick overview of how we're facilitating the discussion here today. As we have at most meetings, we're hoping to have a rich dialogue with you all. As we're going through the presentation, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the chat window, and you can leave comments there that we'll address as we get to the Q&A portions of the presentation. And when we do get to the Q&A portion, if you wanted to actually verbalize a comment as well, I'd appreciate it if you could use the hand raise function. And that's a little blue hand at the bottom of your menu or participant window that you click on that, and that'll pop a little blue hand next to your name. And or you dial *9 on your phone if you dialed in, and that will do the same thing. And that'll alert me that you would like to contribute, and I can call on you and we'll unmute you if needed to start that part of the process. And sure, you all are Zoom pros by now, but just wanted to cover a few of those logistics before we get started. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric to get us going.
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Yurkovich. I'm an associate principal at Ramey & Associates, and I am going to kind of walk us through an overview presentation on the land use alternatives, provide a little bit more background about the Lindenville area, and kind of set the context for the bulk of the meeting, which will really be spent in small group discussions, talking about those land use alternatives for the Lindenville area. At the conclusion of those small group discussions, we'll launch a survey that you all can take part in and tell us a little bit more about your thoughts and ideas for the Lindenville area. And then we'll wrap up with a mini report back out of our small group discussions, and we will meet back here. With that, though, we're going to ask you a few questions to get a better sense of who is in the room and participating today with us. So we've launched a little survey to get a better sense of race and ethnicity of the people who are participating in the event, what age you are, and what neighborhood you're from. So if you could just take a quick moment to fill in this survey so we have a better sense of who is participating today. And we'll give you all a second to fill this in.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm going to leave it open just for maybe 5 more seconds here. So far, only 3 people have taken the poll. Wait a few more seconds here. And I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind to mute yourself. If you haven't already, I'm trying to mute a few folks. It looks like you're continuing to unmute yourself. I hear a lot of background noise, so if you wouldn't mind muting your mic, I would appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and close this now so we can see the results. Looks like we have a fairly good mix. Obviously, we are talking about the Lindenville area, although we have a pretty good mix of folks joining us from different neighborhoods or sub areas throughout the city. So thank you for taking that poll. Eric, should we launch the other poll real quick too while we're here?
Yeah.
We had one other poll that we would like just to get your quick feedback on as to what meetings you've actually attended previously, just so we kind of get a sense of kind of who's in the room and other information that you've heard. And I might actually just do the other one real quick as well as how you heard about the event. We'll make these super short and quick. So I'm launching that poll now just to get a sense if you've been to other workshops or other sub-area meetings or pop-up events when we were actually able to meet in person. So if you want to take a few seconds to give us some feedback here real quick. Hoping you all could see the poll. I don't see any results yet. Oh, there we go. See a couple people coming in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. Great, looks like you all have joined us at workshops in the past, a smattering of sub-area meetings or pop-up meetings, so a little bit of everything, which is great. Thank you again for taking the time and joining us. So we're going to do one last one. Thank you for your patience here. I'm going to go ahead and launch this last one. I just want to get a sense of how you all heard about the event, just so as we kind of continue to do our outreach, just to make sure that we're doing it effectively and what's working. So just a few seconds here, and then I'll hand it back over to you, Eric. Thank you all for indulging, doing this fun exercise with us. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. It looks like email is working well for most of you all. The mailers also have been reaching you, which is great, and all different types of activities. So thank you for doing that. We'll have more opportunity to talk about this and other during the Q&A exercises, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Eric to get us through the presentation. Thanks all.
Great, thanks, Dave. So this is a really exciting part of the larger Shape SSF general plan update process, where we get to really dig into different policy ideas for different sub areas within South San Francisco and think about what the future could look like. And so today is really an opportunity for us to kind of learn a little bit about where we are in the process and then review some of these long range ideas for different land use and mobility options within the Lindenville area. So many of you maybe know what Shape SSF is, but if you don't know, it's really the process to update the city's general plan, climate action plan, zoning code, and environmental impact report. The general plan itself is a kind of a long range policy document to guide the future actions, policy choices, and even the development applications for future projects within South San Francisco. The general plan really allows us to come together as a community and develop a common vision for the future of the city. We went through a long and extensive community engagement process starting in the fall of last year and through the spring of this year, where we helped define that vision, a set of core values and guiding principles for the general plan update. And I suggest if you haven't seen that yet, you go to the Shape SSF website to take a look at that. The general plan also allows us to really think about what the core community strengths are within the city and really to start to address the various topics of concern that rise out of our community conversations with you. And then we can really start to incorporate new ideas and new policies around things like healthy communities, climate change, social equity, and environmental justice. The general plan itself doesn't stand alone. There's a lot of existing planning documents that have been developed in conjunction with the community over the last 10 years or so. And it's our job really to lift up the key elements of each of those plans, the themes, the different projects within each of those documents, and really weave them into the general plan itself. In here in the Lindenville area, things like the bicycle and pedestrian master plan, the East of 101 transportation plan, and even some of the work around sea level rise along Colma Creek are really impact what happens within the Lindenville area. This diagram shows where we are in the overall planning process. Last year, we did a lot of exploration, both quantitative in reviewing what the existing conditions data tell us, and published a series of reports on the Shape SSF website. We also went and collected a lot of qualitative data in a series of listening sessions around South San Francisco to really hear what the core strengths are, issues, opportunities were within South San Francisco. And that really helped us to develop a vision and set of guiding principles that are part of the general plan process. We're now at the stage where we're developing these land use alternatives to kind of test different policy ideas this summer, so we can really have a better sense of what you think is the right policy direction for the city. We'll take all that information and develop a final land use plan and a set of policy frameworks to help implement that land use plan. And then we'll subsequently release the public draft of the general plan in 2021 with releases of the EIR, zoning code, and climate action plan to follow up that. We're really moving through this process right now of testing and refining land use alternatives for South San Francisco as a city, and then also within different sub-areas of the city over the summer. And we've been going through this process of meetings, community meetings, both citywide and at the sub-area level. We'll take all of that input and really start to craft what we call the general plan land use map in the summer and fall of 2022 or 2020. And then once we've kind of established what that general plan land use map is, we'll really start to define the very specifics of the zoning code. So the things that guide both the quantitative standards for new development and some of those qualitative attributes of future development in the winter and spring of 2021. When we start to develop the alternatives, we do a series of background analysis, as I mentioned before, both kind of qualitative and quantitative. And I'm going to share some of that information with you about the Lindenville area. So you all know that the area is really situated between Highway 101, the Orange Park neighborhood, downtown to the north, and then San Bruno to the south of Lindenville. It's bisected by Coma Creek, and it's primarily industrial and service uses within this district. But it has maintained itself as a kind of a significant employment area for the city. This map shows those existing, that existing distribution of land uses within the Lindenville area, kind of bound here by the gray area. This is the Lindenville area here to 101 that we'll be talking about specifically today with the land use alternatives. And you can see that just about 80% of the area is kind of defined as industrial uses. And those are things like logistics, warehousing, manufacturing uses. But there are also a number of kind of retail and service uses shown in red. And then some of these larger areas in darker gray that are devoted to things like transportation uses or utility uses, things like the Park and Fly shuttle spot next to the Highway 101. As I mentioned, that Lindenville has kind of stayed as a employment center for the city. It's about 17% of the jobs, so about a fifth of the jobs within the city are here in Lindenville, about 10,000 jobs. And as I mentioned before, as you can see in the land use map, those are really in kind of this industrial nature, whether they're wholesale trade, transportation, warehousing, manufacturing, construction. Those are some of the composition of jobs that are within the Lindenville area. When we went through our process to kind of both understand the quantitative baseline data within the city and within Lindenville specifically, we started to identify a handful of issues. We layered on a lot of the qualitative data that we heard during our first sub-area meeting in Lindenville back in the fall of 2019. And we have a list of kind of some of these key issues that we're going to be thinking about as we develop land use alternatives, and then also we start to develop policy ideas for the Lindenville area. These include things like the pressure to convert land to other uses, from industrial to other uses. There's sea level rise and flooding potential, which you can see on this map in blue. There are other things like environmental and industrial hazards in the area, including airport noise from SFO and the SFO flight pattern. There are issues around parking, traffic, block pattern, and there are a few neighborhood amenities, including parks and services and so forth. And so we're going to launch a poll now with a little bit of a broader list of these issues that have been identified both in the quantitative analysis, but also those qualitative discussions with you, to get a sense of what you think are the most important issues within the Lindenville area. And so we'd like you to kind of rank what you think are the two most important issues here. And I'll kind of go through the list. So business displacement, sea level rise and flooding, poor street connectivity, lack of daily amenities, lack of park space, environmental pollution, limited parking, lack of housing, and lack of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. And these are all ideas that we heard both through those community meetings, but also in our kind of technical analysis as well. So if you could identify the top two, we can kind of get a sense of what you think are some of those most important issues for us to address in the general plan.
Great, thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
I see the votes coming in. We'll leave it open for maybe for 10 more seconds. Looks like we've had only about 10 respondents so far, and it looks like we have about, outside of city staff, a good 25 to 30 members of the public joining us. So thank you again for spending your afternoon with us today. Just going to wait a couple more seconds here. We're almost there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results out. Interesting. Yeah, every time we do this, we get different results, and each may have looked as expected, but looks like lack of amenities is taking the lead here, followed by lack of housing and lack of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. But interesting enough, everything got a vote, or at least a few votes across the board. So clearly interested in seeing some improvement in the Lindenville area overall. So thank you for that. All right, back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Dave. And I will say that these polls give us a good opportunity to let me catch my breath a second and go through the next section of the slides. So one of the things that we always talk about when we look at land use alternatives are what is on the ground now, that's the existing land use, but also what the current policy vision is for the future. So this is the guiding policy that you'll find in the current general plan, which was adopted in 1999 and last updated in 2015. And this is really the guiding policy for the Lindenville area. So it's really to maintain the industrial character of the area, to develop some additional street and through connections within the larger blocks of Lindenville, and to really improve the buffering between those industrial areas and the existing residential areas, both to the north, which is downtown, but also to the west, which is the kind of the Orange Park neighborhood. So when we're going to talk a little bit about those land use alternatives and what we're testing in those land use alternatives in just a second, but before I get into that, I want to just kind of describe what the land use alternatives are. These are really different kind of land use and urban design patterns that we use to test different policy questions. So we want to test what is the right kind of balance and mix of jobs in Lindenville. Do we kind of maintain the industrial land? Do we focus more on office in the future? How do we think about producing more housing, both for the workforce and then also affordable housing in South San Francisco? Can some of that be in the Lindenville area, and if so, where? So we really use these land use alternatives to kind of test these ideas and these policy ideas that we want to have a discussion about, so that we can start to make informed choices about these trade-offs in land use into the future. And then once we've started to kind of understand what the preferences are and what these kind of policy questions are that we're answering, we can begin to develop the policies and implementation actions that are a kind of a core component of the general plan and the general plan update. These land use alternatives really kind of test three big ideas. So really they're looking at the pattern of land use, so kind of across the whole city or across the whole sub area. What's the mix of residential mixed use, residential uses, commercial uses, industrial? And then within smaller areas, what's the mix of land uses? So if you have a land use type that's mixed use, is it more focused on residential or is it more focused on commercial uses? And then in the land use alternatives, we're really testing the relative level of intensity. So kind of on a gradient from higher to lower intensity. So we can get a sense of people's preferences for these. We then take all that information and we have a series of kind of evaluation criteria that we use to kind of understand the differences between these different land use patterns within each of these areas. So things like the balance of jobs and housing, how travel changes, and the greenhouse gas emissions. As part of that analysis, we start to think about what the trend has been in terms of the market conditions, but also where it's moving into the future. So as we're thinking about the land use conditions, we're not thinking about just today, what's happening today, but also those future conditions. And we know that biotechnology and life sciences are going to continue to be a primary driver of development activity within the city, and that there's still And while kind of the overall demand for production, distribution, and repair has kind of been reduced over the last 10 years, we know there will still be a strong demand for it based on its regional location in the city. And that we also know that while retail has been struggling, and particularly right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that as we add housing and we add more jobs to the city, there'll be opportunities to add incremental levels of retail to support those new residents and businesses in the future. And we know that I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has had unprecedented impacts on the whole country and the whole globe. Unemployment rates are up to 14% in South City. We know there's been diminished demand for retail and hospitality uses, and this has really compromised the fiscal health of a lot of cities and counties across the state of California and across the nation. But we also know that some of those intrinsic assets that South San Francisco aren't going anywhere. And so we want to, as we think about economic recovery and to longer term growth, we want to make sure we build on those assets. There's a lot of things we don't know about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic over the long term, how long the economic and market implications will last into the future. We also know there's been a lot of social behavioral change in how we work and how we travel, and we don't know exactly how that will, what proportion of that will kind of maintain into the future, or whether we'll just go back to our previous patterns of work and travel. We also look at the long-term housing within and housing demand within South San Francisco as we look at the long-term land use alternatives. And so we know between about 2015 and about 2020, the city of South San Francisco permitted about 1,000 new housing units within the city. That accommodated about half of what the city's regional housing needs assessment allocation was from the period of 2015 to 2030 and their current housing element cycle. This city, as part of the Bay Area region, is now undergoing an updated process to redo the regional housing needs assessment. And while we don't know for certain what will be asked of South San Francisco to accommodate in terms of new housing, we understand that it's likely to be 2 to 4 times what the current regional housing needs assessment is. So anywhere between 3,700 new units to 7,400 new housing units between 2022 and 2030. But the general plan is not just looking at an 8-year period to 2030 or a 10-year period out to 2030. We're really looking at 2 to 3 of these housing element cycles and these regional housing needs assessment cycles. So we're looking at kind of this demand for somewhere between 11 and 22,000 new housing units within the city by 2045. So we're starting to think about these longer term projections in terms of housing units as part of this land use alternatives process. These land use alternatives are really built on what we call place types, or these building blocks. So when you look at the land use maps, they're going to be colorful, and these colors really represent these different building blocks. And so I'm going to go through a few of them so you can kind of see what they look and feel like. So when you look at those colors on the map, you'll have a sense of what they are. So this is an example of high density mixed use. Here's an example of medium density mixed use. Here's an example of lower density mixed use. And so you'll see these mixed use types on these 3 mixed use types on the Lindenville maps. You'll also see a color for office development, as well as business and technology park. And then you'll see a type that you don't see necessarily in South San Francisco at the moment, which is this idea of mixed industrial high, which is an allowance for higher intensity industrial uses. And then we're always thinking about the adjacency between different parcels and each other, especially as areas may or may not intensify over time. So in particular, how does Lindenville relate to the Orange Park residential neighborhood just to the west? How does it relate to the downtown neighborhood just to the north? And so we want to think about how these different areas and these different nodes of intensity kind of transition between residential uses. And you can see these are just a couple of those strategies, whether it's building heights and setbacks, whether it's landscaping. There's lots of different ways to be thinking about that. So what are the land use alternatives for the Lindenville area? So we really tested these kind of big ideas. So what does it look like to allow the kind of the downtown mixed use pattern to move south towards Colma Creek and then beyond Colma Creek, to kind of create that pattern of mixed use, so residential, commercial uses all mixed together like downtown, to really reinforce Grand Avenue as that central heart of the city. The alternatives really test adding housing back into Lindenville. Lindenville was once a part of the city that accommodated a fair amount of housing, and the alternatives are going to show that allowing housing back into Lindenville in different patterns and in different amounts. We also consider the future of the mixed industrial area, whether we want to allow it to kind of maintain itself into the future, allow it to intensify over time, or allowing more office development to happen within the area. We look specifically along the South Spruce corridor, kind of creating a mixed-use corridor from the downtown area down to the El Camino corridor. And you'll see on all the alternatives opportunities for improving connectivity, addressing sea level rise, and really transforming Colma Creek into an amenity for the community. And on all of the alternatives in the Lindenville area, you'll see this idea of transforming Colma Creek. And so this really builds on the work that's being done and has been done around adaptation planning around the creek. So these are things to allow the water to improve kind of water management and flood control within the Colma Creek corridor, but then also to really allow nature back into the corridor. So how do we create biophilia within South San Francisco? How do we create those places for nature and bring that back up Colma Creek into the city? And then really creating a place that we can gather, like as a social gathering point, but also to travel, to do non-auto travel. So bike and pedestrians can kind of traverse the city along the Colma Creek corridor. So we're really kind of thinking about those three big design ideas when we're talking about Colma Creek improvements. And so this is kind of the initial draft revision to the vision statement and guiding policy within the general plan for the Lindenville sub-area. So I'm going to read the vision statement and talk through some of the policies. So the first is to really create an enhanced mixed-use district that maintains a base of middle-wage jobs and promotes the creative economy while capitalizing on access to downtown and to BART. That vision statement is really supported by a series of guiding policies, one about preserving a core of industrial and service spaces within the Lindenville area, to actively promote the arts and art institutions within the Lindenville area, to really sustain a diverse mix of uses within the district, particularly higher intensities near the downtown area, San Bruno BART station. And then really kind of thinking about how we can proactively build resilience to sea level rise along the Colma Creek, and really think about how we can make that a corridor for access, a corridor for nature, and a corridor for managing floodwaters, and really thinking about how we can connect the district both internally with smaller streets, but also to east of 101, to downtown, to El Camino, and to Orange Park. Now we're going to launch a poll right now to get, just off the cuff, to get a sense of whether you agree with this statement and what you think about it. And we're going to talk very specifically in the breakout groups about this guiding vision and policy statement, so you'll have more of an opportunity to kind of dig into the details in the small group discussions.
That's right. Thanks, Eric. I do see it populating here pretty quickly. We'll give it maybe 10 more seconds, and we could report out the results. And as Eric mentioned, there will be plenty of opportunity. We're going to dive into this deeply in the small groups. I don't see any other chat or discussions that have been popping up either as we've been going through the presentation, but feel free to log them in there, and or if you have a burning question to use the raise your hand feature, and we could unmute you that way as well. So I'm just going to wait a few more seconds here. Okay. I guess everyone's probably logged in at once too, so I'm going to end the poll now, share out the results. Interesting. A little bit all over the board, but most kind of either are neutral or potentially disagree with the vision and policy statement the way it stands. So it'd be really interesting to dig into these during the small groups and get your input as to why you might have voted the way you did. Great, thank you. It looks like we had just one question from Wendy that just came in as to how will it be decided what happens to Lindenville? That's a fairly general question. I know Eric's been kind of delving in a little bit deeper, and we'll be talking about the actual alternatives here shortly, so that might help answer that question. If you'd like to hold off on that, Wendy, if that's okay. And then Sal asked, is mass transit systems like BART and or monorail being considered for Lindenville? Eric, did you want to field that now, or maybe hold that off for the alternatives as well?
Well, I'll just say that there's no discussion about a fixed guideway system, which is what a BART or a monorail would be. So something that has tracks and would run kind of in a fixed course. But we have talked about if Lindenville changes over time to allow more residential, kind of these more areas of mixed use, which we'll talk about in the land use alternative. There are specific streets like Spruce and Linden that might benefit from having higher frequency transit on those streets. Maybe there are buses or some other future transit option that we're not sure even exist quite yet. But those would be kind of options that you'd want to look at within those particular corridors.
Great, thanks, Eric. We'll take one more question here, and some of this will most likely be answered as we go through the presentation. But Russell asks, what types of jobs are middle wage jobs, and the number of jobs that are expected, and the expected wage range?
Yeah, there's some very specific, there's kind of a couple ways to answer that question, but there's kind of some standardized definitions that you could say are middle wage jobs. So they are jobs that allow you to be significantly above the poverty level. And I don't know off the top of my head what those that wage classification is off the top of my head. And so those could be jobs like office jobs and kind of those kind of information technology jobs. Those could also be some of those manufacturing jobs or some of those logistics jobs, which do pay good wages and often are a good source of employment and job space for the city. So each of those different sectors has kind of a different kind of a selection of wages that you would look at.
Great, thanks, Eric. With that, I'll hand it back over to you to go on to the next section of the presentation.
Thanks, Dave. All right, so I'm going to present the three alternatives now, and I'll do each one at a time, and then I'll kind of bring them all back together on the same screen so you can see them all. Then I'll kind of talk through the specific questions that you'll be working through in your small groups. So this is alternative number one. Alternative number one does a few things. First, it really maintains this area here south of Colma Creek as a mixed industrial area. It allows the kind of mixed use pattern of the downtown area to move south from Railroad Avenue south down to Colma Creek, but then keeps this pattern of mixed industrial here in this core area. It also allows here along the 101 freeway and where the kind of the Park and Fly site is, to have some of that business and technology park use here in the Lindenville area, something that's more common in the east of 101 area. This would kind of maintain that core amount of jobs within the Lindenville area and then add some amount of housing, particularly north of Colma Creek. This is some of those images, those place types that we showed on the earlier slides. And this kind of illustrates where you might expect to see those different place types and what they might look and feel like in different areas of Lindenville here. And then one of the things that we wanted to also show you is how alternative one changes the current land use pattern that's allowed under the current general plan. So you see on the left-hand side, alternative 1, that's the kind of the complete map. And on the right-hand side, you can see the areas where those land use changes have been from that current general plan. So again, most of the change happens here above Colma Creek, between Railroad and Colma Creek, here allowing that mixed residential neighborhood here, mixed here, and then allowing the business technology park along the 101 corridor here. The second alternative really kind of creates this larger residentially focused mixed-use neighborhood right along Colma Creek. And it kind of, what it does is sort of leverages this idea of Colma Creek becoming an amenity for the community and creates a residential neighborhood on both sides of the creek all the way down to Victory Avenue. It also allows kind of mixed residential along the 101 corridor in this darker purple here. So in alternative 1, you saw that as that business technology park. In this one, it's a kind of a residentially focused mixed use. And then in this alternative, you see that office is kind of allowed to kind of move up to that Victory Avenue as well. And so this alternative, you don't see any of that maintenance of and maintaining that mixed industrial area here in Lindenville. And then it really allows this kind of corridor of mixed use down south along Spruce Avenue to kind of keep connecting downtown down to El Camino here in the southern section. And this alternative adds more housing and also more jobs to the Lindenville area. This is kind of an image or an array of images to show you what this looks and feels like in the Lindenville area. This next map really shows what the changes to those land use designations would be. So alternative 2, again, is on your left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, you can see where we've changed from the current general plan in alternative to alternative 2. So you can see this is a significant change, particularly in this core area of Lindenville. Alternative 3 really creates a much higher density residential neighborhood, really centered on Colma Creek here, with again, with allowing more of that residential mixed use along the 101 corridor. In this alternative, we do preserve a significant chunk of the Lindenville area as industrial, but in this alternative, we've allowed it to intensify over time. So we've kind of designated it as mixed industrial high. This would really allow those properties to improve over time to become kind of that multi-story industrial space that you might see in the future. And so this also increases the number of housing units within the site as well. So again, here is a kind of a quick look at what that looks and feels like in the Lindenville area. And you can see here, again, the alternative number 3 is shown on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you can see the areas of change. And now I'll just say that the gray is essentially the same as industrial, but what we said here is that we're allowing it to intensify. So we're showing it as kind of a change in the current general plan land use for the area. And then this kind of sets all 3 of those alternatives next to each other so that you can see across the 3 alternatives and compare them across each of them. So I'll just quickly run through them. So each of the 3 alternatives shows kind of a residential mixed use down to Colma Creek. In alternative 1, you can see we've maintained this core area for mixed industrial area, but allowed there to be some business and technology park here along the 101 corridor. We've also sort of allowed this kind of commercial space to be maintained along Spruce Avenue kind of as it is. Alternative 2, as I mentioned before, really kind of creates this mixed-use residential neighborhood focused on Colma Creek on both sides of it, down to kind of Victory Avenue. But it also allows the expansion of office uses up to Victory Avenue in this sort of peachy pink color. And then it really kind of focuses a little mixed-use corridor along Spruce Avenue to connect downtown down into the El Camino area here. And then alternative 3 really allows that higher intensity residential neighborhood to be tested here with expanded higher intensity industrial allowed, and this kind of core maintained here in alternative number 3. In each of these alternatives, you'll see kind of these dots or lines on the map that show these different mobility improvements. So these are on all of the maps that you'll see. These include the Colma Creek bike and pedestrian connections, Utah interchange and street connections, and then some new complete streets and road connectivity within the district. So you'll see those kind of as dotted lines on all of those maps. And then this is just a simple list of some of those opportunities and challenges. And I think just we want to make sure to raise some of these. So the opportunities in Lindenville are really to help reinforce the downtown areas, that kind of heart and core of the area. There's also opportunities to preserve industrial and service uses and businesses into the future. There's also opportunities to help with the local housing crisis with the development of new affordable and workforce housing within the Lindenville area. And there's also opportunities to really support both BART in San Bruno, but then Caltrain transit ridership, and to reduce the need for some of those private vehicle use. Some of those challenges we kind of talked about throughout, there's the potential for the displacement of commercial and industrial businesses in the area. We talked about addressing sea level rise and Colma Creek flooding, and that we also know that the area has a limited street network, and it's kind of disconnected from the downtown east of 101 area in particular. So there's opportunities and challenges associated with that. So we're going to stop now. We're going to launch a quick poll in which we're going to ask you just off the cuff what you think if you were to prefer any of these alternatives, whether they're the current general plan, alternative 1, 2, or 3. Just to get a sense of where you are right now. We're going to talk more specifically about those alternatives in the small group breakout discussions in just a moment. And we won't hold you to these particular answers. And then we also want to know a little bit about how important you think it is for the city to balance future jobs and housing. So we'd ask you to kind of respond to that as well. I will dig out some of the questions that have been popping up in the chat as well. And we can answer a few of those and then head into our small group discussions in just a second. Great.
Thank you, Eric. Eric, if you go to the Miro board, we do have them all there, but I'll pitch a couple to you as I set up the small groups here. Russell asked, how much land is free for future developments in Lindenville?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. The city has a fairly small set of vacant land. I think land use changes within Lindenville, like other parts of South San Francisco, would generally be on parcels that already have some development on them. So whether they're an existing commercial building or otherwise, there are some opportunities like the Park and Fly site along the freeway, which are not vacant per se, but don't have intense buildings already on them. So there would be some opportunities like that.
Great, thanks, Eric. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll and share those results real quick. Interesting. Looks like neck and neck maybe between alternative 3 and the current general plan. Again, will be an opportunity to talk through this shortly as we get into all small groups. We're going to dive deeply into the alternatives. And in terms of a balance between jobs and housing, it looks like a good half of you all noted that it is very important. So good to note. Thank you for that. Okay, team, I just want to make sure my team got, yep, we got a snapshot of it. Okay, great. So I'm going to stop sharing results, and then we'll field a couple more questions here while we split you all into breakout rooms. We had a question from Wendy. Is there housing in these scenarios that will be very close to Tan Fran?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we looked at that. There is housing, particularly if you're attend the El Camino meeting tonight, where we'll be talking about housing in that area, in the southern kind of center at where the Safeway site is now. So looking at that as being some opportunity to add housing into that area. We've largely kind of kept the housing in the Lindenville, in the northern section of Lindenville, closer to downtown, closer to Caltrain, and really to kind of reinforce those commercial and service businesses in the downtown area. But that could be a point of discussion tonight. If you think, if you and your group think that that's something we need to explore, we can certainly look into that as well.
Great, thanks, Eric. Tim asks how many new units and office square footage for each one of the alternatives. I don't know if we have that breakout, but
we don't have that. We don't have that breakout per se. We looked at, in general, kind of the quantities across the city, and we presented that at the citywide alternatives workshop on July the 14th. And you can go back and look at those data. But we basically kind of maintain the same amount of commercial across each of the alternatives in terms of the number of jobs. Just the mix and distribution was different between industrial space, office, and R&D space within the city. And then the alternatives really kind of test these different levels of housing. So kind of a 13,000 housing units up to kind of 22,000 housing units in alternative 3. So each, as you go from 1 to 2 to 3, you see an increase in those number of housing units. And Diana just placed in the chat, thanks Diana, a link to that presentation and that information.
Great, thanks, Eric. Looks like we had a couple general comments that maybe I'll read through real quick just to make sure you all saw it. One was, during the presentation, biotech was mentioned as a driving force for housing and to reinforce housing in downtown and Lindenville area with higher intensities within those areas due to the close proximity of BART. So Spruce 101 in downtown area, to Spruce 101 in downtown area, I'm concerned about not taking SSF, BART, and El Camino Real into consideration for biotech housing force. If their housing proposed on El Camino, since it was ample land, will be closed to businesses. Oh, I guess the question is there housing proposed on El Camino since it has ample land with closed businesses with 2 or 3 lanes?
You got it. Here,
you want to try to do
so effectively effectively the question is asking whether or not there's housing proposed on El Camino.
Right.
We are looking at that as part of the land use alternatives. So tonight we're doing the El Camino workshop from 6 to 8. You're welcome to join that meeting as well. It's one of kind of the 4 sub areas in the city where we anticipate there being the most sort of land use change within the city and the most growth overall in the city. And this is kind of consistent with the previous vision for the general plan that was adopted back in 1999 and then also updated in 2015. So really kind of thinking about these 4 primary areas to accommodate growth within the city. So downtown, Lindenville, east of 101, and the El Camino corridor.
Great, thanks, Eric. There's one comment that I think might have just come directly to me. It says the challenges or proposed changes will also impact residents who depend on the services of the businesses that are in Lindenville. So thanks for that, Sal. Definitely duly noted, and something we can talk about some more as we get into our small groups. Wendy had a couple more responses here, Eric, if you want to take a look at those. I'm going to go ahead and finish up getting the small groups ready.
Right, and so Wendy was effectively saying it's worth looking at housing near the San Fran and the San Bruno BART station. So that's something we can talk about in our small group discussion, and to kind of create a street connection from Sneak to San Fran Avenue, since the rail track is defunct. So we can talk about that more specifically. I'm going to do this while Dave is working and putting you all into breakout rooms right now. So we're going to send you all into breakout rooms with facilitators. We have a couple of facilitators for each room, and we're going to go through kind of a series of small group discussion questions as a group. At the end of that, we'll kind of launch a survey about the planning sub-area and the preferred land use alternative and implementation strategies, which we'd like you to do if possible at that time. So here, when you get into the sub-area, into your small group discussions, these are the discussion questions which you'll be tackling as a group. So do you agree with the updated vision statement and policy direction for the area? Why or why not? So we heard a lot of disagreement with that. So the first question we want to tackle. And then second, we have a series of specific questions about the land use alternative. So do you agree with adding a new Coma Creek residential neighborhood over time? Should an area be preserved for industrial? Should it be allowed to intensify over time? And what are some of the pros and cons of allowing more office development within this area? And then at the end of that, we kind of just get a sense of what your preferred alternatives are for the area, and then other things that were not explored in the alternatives that you want to bring up that are important. And then if there's time, what some of the priority area improvements are or strategies are for things like open space, housing, affordable housing, small business preservation within the Lindenville area.
Great. Thank you, Eric. I think I have all the rooms set up. One question I wanted to ask before we do split you up into these groups is if there are any Spanish-speaking folks who will be having this interpreted as I'm saying it. If you can please use the hand raise function, either at the bottom of your participant window or by dialing *9. Just to let me know that you would like to be in a room that's actually facilitated in Spanish. That would be super helpful. And we could make that accommodation now. I don't see anything popping up, but if that is something that you need, you could definitely let your facilitators know and we could move you around once we split you up, but I don't see that need currently. So I have you all set up currently in rooms. So I'm gonna press a button now and you'll see something pop up on your screen that'll ask you to enter a room, and then just give us a couple minutes while we get situated and we'll get the facilitators in that room with you and we'll start the discussion. So thank you so much and have fun. Here you go. Welcome back to the main room, all. Thank you for sticking it out with us. I was popping around all the rooms. Sounded like some very informed discussion. So thank you all for being so engaged in the process. We're gonna wait a couple more minutes here, let folks populate back in this main room, and then we're gonna do a short round of report backs from each one of the rooms. And then Eric will give us a couple items for next steps, and then we'll let you all get on with your day. So I'm gonna wait just one more, or just maybe 30 seconds here. It looks like folks are still joining us. There we go. Okay, I think we have everyone back now. Thank you all again for taking the time today, spending your afternoon with us. I mentioned earlier I was popping around all the rooms and it sounded like some really informed, engaged discussion. Clearly all of the future of South San Francisco, which is what we love to see. So now we're just going to do a quick round of follow-up from each one of the room discussions. I'm going to ask the facilitators the key themes of their discussion, and then we're going to do a couple next step slides that Eric will share with us of what's kind of happening from here, and then we'll let you all go about your day. So I'm going to do it backwards this time and start with group 3. So Rosemary or Megan, would one of you like to please report out on your key themes? Sure. If you're ready, you should be able to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So our group was more on the pro-housing side of things. In terms of the vision statement, there were just a lot of questions and information to take in. And we want to make sure that our group wanted to make sure that whatever options we choose for non-residential were sustainable in the long terms and in terms of jobs, changing economics. Overall, as I said, though, pro-housing, and they wanted opportunities for development in this area, and they wanted to make sure that alternatives consider the highest and best uses for sites in the area to make sure that sites are best utilized. They agreed with allowing housing along Colma Creek, and they didn't have strong preferences in terms of industrial and office development. Overall, though, the group leaned towards alternative 3. They wanted to provide lots of housing opportunities, and they thought that being near downtown was a great location for housing, especially near transit and the rest of the downtown amenities. And then our team would also make sure that in addition to the land use changes, that the alternatives provided ample opportunities for open space, access and bike and pedestrian mobility, especially if housing is developed.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Rosemary, was there anything else you wanted to add? Did we cover all our bases there? Excellent.
Pretty much housing, housing, housing.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Patricia and/or Diana, you're up next for your group.
Yeah, so in our team, there was a lot of discussion more about the industrial use. There was one of our team members who was both a resident and a small business owner. And so, you know, sort of from depending on which hat he was wearing, he could see that as a small business owner, alternative 1 is a better option because he wanted to make sure that the zoning for small business can remain and that they wouldn't be displaced. And so that was a very important part of the conversation. However, as a resident, then he could see that alternative 3 was a better option. And that was also the vote that the other members in our group went towards. So there was a lot of questions as to what would happen with the changing of the zoning and making sure that small businesses that were in that gray area could remain and not be displaced and then not be able to afford to run their businesses.
Great, great, thank you. Diane, anything else to add to your group before we go to group 1? No? Okay. All right, Eric and/or Troy, you're up next.
Oh, we had a lively discussion, some of the same themes as the other groups. We spoke a bit about the need to intensify the areas that can take advantage of the proximity downtown, proximity to the bar station. But we also saw value in retaining.
Troy, we're losing you a little bit. Sorry, you're cutting out.
But that.
Yeah, you're back now.
Talked about the value of adding some new intensity of housing here within appropriate conditions. Talking about we don't want too much high rise, but we can balance those potential residents with new open spaces, new connections to downtown, new retail. Also that there's a value in saving the industrial uses there. That the idea of mixing industrial with some new housing was very attractive, which is why we leaned somewhat towards alternative 3 in that regard, in that there's a nice mix of housing and industrial, but that alternative 2, the intensity of alternative 2's housing might be more appropriate in some of those locations right by the existing downtown neighborhoods. In general, we felt like there was a preference for more residential or industrial rather than office closer to Tan Fran in that area.
Great. Thank you, Troy, and thank you all again. Eric, anything else to add to that one? Nope. Okay, excellent. Again, thank you so much for that great discussion. That was really helpful for us as we move forward here. And again, really value your time and effort. And I'm going to hand it back over to Eric to quickly walk us through next steps, and then we'll wrap up here.
Great, thanks, Dave. Just a couple of quick slides. We want to hear from you and your neighbors and your colleagues. There's a web page on the shapessf.net website //alternatives with links to upcoming meetings, primer videos on land use and alternatives, maps, descriptions, and then links to the surveys. There are surveys for citywide, but then also the downtown El Camino, east of 101 in the Lindenville survey that you all did today. We'd encourage you to share that with your friends and colleagues and neighbors, as well as do the other surveys if you haven't had a chance to do that. We have, this is the process to date and into the future on the alternatives. We did a citywide workshop on the 14th and Planning Commission on the 16th of this month with sub-area meetings in east of 101 and downtown on the 20th of last week. Recordings and materials for all of those meetings are up and on the website, and we're working on doing a synthesis of the summary of those notes, and those will be up in the next couple of weeks as well. We have tonight is the El Camino sub-area meeting. It's from 6 to 8 p.m. It's the same Zoom link that you used to get on to this meeting today. So if you're interested, come tonight and talk about the El Camino corridor. We also recently added another downtown meeting on Monday, August 17th. We decided after much discussion that we wanted to take a little bit more time in downtown to hear from more of the residents in the area about the changes that are happening in the area and some of those issues that they see in the future. And then also there's a joint Planning Commission and City Council meeting on August 19th where we'll summarize what we've heard at these meetings and then talk to Planning Commission and Council about the land use alternatives. So finally, one last way for you all to get involved in the process. We've just added this new set of virtual office hours. You can come and ask city staff about the Shape SSF process, ongoing planning and initiatives. If you have questions for planning staff, you're welcome to drop in each Tuesday in August from 12 to 1 p.m. to talk to city planning staff about what's going on in the city or this process. And it'll be kind of come in, drop in as you please. There's no set agenda. There won't be any presentation, just kind of a free-flowing discussion if you have questions that you have about planning in the city. Yeah. And so finally, just one last plug, come to shapessf.net and join our mailing list, learn all about the alternatives, learn more about the process and see the background materials. It's all up there. If you have general questions, please feel free to contact Lisa Costa-Saunders. And I just want to thank you all again. Many of you have now come to multiple of these meetings, and we really appreciate your dedication, your thoughtfulness, and all the ideas that you've been bringing to the table. We look forward to kind of continuing this collaborative work with you over the next several months on these land use alternatives in the future. So thanks a lot, everyone. We really appreciate you all coming here tonight.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. I just want to note one thing. You might have already mentioned it, but the recording from this presentation will also be posted to the project website along with the summary. There was a question that popped up about that, so I just want to reiterate that. We've been posting all of the recordings, which is great because we're all on Zoom now, so it makes it simple after each one of these meetings. So definitely look out for it there. I saw a hand pop up, but it looks like it went back down as I was talking, so I think that is it. Thanks again, all. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.